Hey everyone, welcome to Broken Lord Order. On today's Off Topic Tuesdays, we're going to be taking a look at the Snakemen of Khuresh. I want to thank Dominic Hindes for suggesting this. I've actually wanted to always talk about the Snakemen of Khuresh, but I figured there wasn't much interest, so when he suggested this last week, man was I stoked. Anyways, kick back, grab a drink, and let's get into it.
Wow.
So, in spite of all the things we don't know about the Snake Men, and we'll get to that later on, there's actually quite a bit we do know. So, let's start with one of the most obvious ones, the things that they are most renowned for, that being their sort of vampiric elements. The Snake Men's entire culture revolves around blood. Their leadership is literally called the Blood Naga Queens. They use blood as a currency. Whenever they kill people, their victims are always completely drained of blood. Blood is central to what the Snake Men culture revolves around. I think that'd be a really cool trait. You know, if it was in game, you would probably expect there to be some vampiric corruption, although they could also use chaotic corruption, and we'll get to that later. But I think that that vampiric element is one of the more cool things about Snake Men. I mean, you could have bonuses for, especially post-battle bonuses for having drained all your victims of blood. You could have your economy revolve around having to get victims and drain them and everything like that. I think it'd be kind of a fun trait for them to have. Of course, as you'd probably expect, if they are this vampiric, they'd probably have some form of regeneration, right? It seems pretty lore accurate in that sense then. And that blood element gives way to about the only confirmed unit that we would for sure know is on the entire Beastmen, or not Beastmen, Snakemen roster, that being the Blood Queens, or the Blood Naga Queens. So having heard all that, you'd probably just think, okay, so whatever, they'd just be another vampiric faction on the map, no big deal. But the thing is that there's also really, really strong evidence that they could be a chaotic faction. So the Snake Men, yes, they deal with blood as their primary form of currency, but they also deal in souls, and soul trading is very strongly linked with forces of chaos. On top of that, the only artifact we know for sure that comes from the Snake Men, the White Sistrum, was known to cause madness just by being around it, which is a trait very commonly associated with Sinch. And then on top of that, Slanesh was known to have an ancient race of serpent warriors. And of course, Slanesh also being a chaotic god, and their aesthetics and their demeanor and their society and everything very strongly mimics that of the Snake Men, possibly implying that they are the exact same faction, which in turn would also further their sort of chaotic elements. So, as much as, I would be okay if they didn't have chaotic corruption, I think there's a very strong case to be made for chaotic corruption, and that could actually tie in really well with them as a species. They'd be the only one on the map that could put out both vampiric and chaotic corruption, which would make trying to invade their territories an absolute nightmare. This kind of ties in perfectly well with the next thing I want to talk about, which is the actual region of Khuresh itself. So Khuresh is below Cathay and slightly to the west of both the nations of Nippon and then the two elven outposts just off to the east of it. Um, the hinterlands are typically avoided in the Warhammer universe, and for darn good reason. Basically, anyone who shows up in there basically dies and disappears on the spot. So even though it would be dramatically beneficial for the Elven outpost to simply go through Koresh and then hook up with the rest of the mainland, they're actually forced down to a narrow choke point in the gates of Caliph as a result of Koresh. And I think that could be represented really well in the game by just having the two forms of attrition run simultaneously, vampiric attrition and chaotic attrition. And then in that way, even though you could have your army in that area, to actually try and get into the heartlands of Koresh would be an absolute slog and an absolute nightmare. It might feel like I'm being intentionally vague or, avoiding the details on purpose or something, but honestly, there is not a lot of confirmed details we do have about the Snake Men. They are a super, super mysterious race in the Warhammer lore. We know more about super minor factions like Ind and Cathay than we do know the Snake Men. Um, with the few things we do know, of course, is the region, Koresh. We know that it is just an absolute nightmare. In fact, that it's called the hinterlands of Koresh. And hinterlands, if you're unfamiliar, it's not a very good term for geography. I'll let you look it up on your own. The other thing we do know of them is the only artifact we've ever gotten out of the region, which is the White Sistrum. It was a drum that was shaped like an hourglass. But anyways, when it was played, it caused just nightmares and madness. Like I said, it was a little bit Sinchian, but the way that it caused madness was by literally just showing off how powerful the Naga were in their earlier ages. It's basically like Lovecraft in a nutshell, and I think that that is absolutely amazing about them. So, of course, the other side of this coin is that there is a ton we don't know about the Snake Men, right? We don't know much about their culture apart from, just the basic elements we touched on earlier. We don't know what their leadership is. We don't have any named characters for them. We don't know what their roster would look like. We don't know, frankly, what they look like. We don't have any official artwork from CA or GW. And frankly, we don't even know where they've came from. Now, that's one of the really, really cool things, and we'll get into that in just a second. But my point is that there was a lot of unknowns still involved with the Snake Men. Now, personally, I think that's actually a good thing, not a bad thing. CA has already shown with Norska and with the Vampire Coast that when they are given free reign to do stuff, they are absolutely awesome at it. I think the Vampire Coast was the single greatest DLC in the entire series so far. So I'd love to see them take a swing at it. Now, whether or not Games Workshop wants to go for that, maybe a different conversation, but I really, really hope that it's not taken off the table just because of how little's known about them. All right, so what are they? There is a ton of fan speculation about this online when I was looking. Like, I've seen at least a good, like, half dozen, if not more, different theories and, like, plausible theories about what they could be. But there's sort of four that stand above the others, and I'll touch upon them all sort of in order now. The first one and the most obvious one is that they're just one of the three major Beastmen hordes in the eastern region. We do know, according to the lore, that there are three Beastmen hordes, but we don't know anything about them. So this theory kind of implies that if the Beastmen near Ind would be one major faction, then it would logically stand to reason that the Snake Men are also one of those major factions of Beastmen. I mean, it's an option on the table. I'm personally not crazy about it because it's kind of an unrewarding answer. But it makes perfect sense, right? You do have these snakes who are essentially a mixture of anthropomorphized, well, snakes, which is exactly what the beastmen typically are. Option two, very similar to option one, is that they are just chaotic snakes, basically the Slaneshi ancient serpents that we spoke of before. Kind of like the previous one, I think it'd be a little bit of an underwhelming option. In fact, even more so than the previous one. I think if they did just turn out to be the ancient serpents from Slanesh, I would just put them into the Slaneshi roster when we get monogods down the line. There wouldn't really be a point to having, the Snake Men even be a thing at that point in time. All right, getting into the fun two and like the more interesting ones now. Third option on the table that I've seen is that they are actually like a corrupted version of the Lizardmen. So historically, the Lizardmen are thought of as being immune to chaos. They are tools of the old gods. They're a very like pure and focused race. So if the Snakemen were to be a corrupted version of them, I think it'd be a very cool parallel to be drawn, right? Um, it's a little hard to justify. The old ones weren't known for dabbling in chaos too much. And like I said, the lizardmen are razor sharp focused on staying pure when it comes to chaos. But again, it would make for a really interesting parallel between the two races, and it could make for some cool plot elements there too. So we'll end this then on my absolute favorite option, the theory that they are just the old ones. In the Warhammer universe, it's implied that all of the old ones disappeared and we don't know where or how or anything like that, but we don't actually know that for sure. We know that the vast majority of them did. We don't see them in the old world or the new world very much anymore, but the eastern regions are very, very unknown. Now, this might seem like just drawing, an idea out of a hat, but the rationales I've seen behind this are actually pretty intelligent. So, in the jungles of the hinterlands, apparently is a temple of the old ones. Now, if the Snakemen were just purely an instrument of chaos, it wouldn't really make sense for there to be an old ones monument in the area. Presumably, they would have destroyed it by now. However, if the Snake Men were the old ones, it wouldn't really make sense to destroy their own stuff, even if they had devolved and, dabbled in chaotic elements, or, maybe they haven't. We don't actually have confirmed proof of that. Um, the other reason that that would make sense, of course, is the creation of the lizardmen. So the very first spawning, the Slan, the Saurus, the Skinks, all of them are based upon reptilian elements. if you're a god, wouldn't you base your spawn upon your own sort of biology? So in that sense, it does make sense that the snake men could be the old ones there. The other reasonings behind this too is, like I said, we only had one artifact come from the snake men or the hinterlands of Khuresh, and that one artifact, just by being heard, would shatter the minds of mortals. Like, that's an incredibly powerful artifact. So it implies that the snake men have a pretty powerful magical ability, which the old ones were renowned for having. Again, it might not be something that GW is okay with confirming or denying or what have you, but if this is an option on the table, this would be one I would absolutely love to see, because this has implications for literally every other single race, and that would be an amazing, amazing plot to explore. So we're not going to get into all of the more small theories or unsubstantiated theories. This video is going to stretch past an hour, and I don't think anyone wants that. So then, to wrap it up, how would the Snake Man be implemented? I think it's a really tough question because of how open it is, right? It's not like one of the races like, I don't know, even say Cathay, where yes, we know little, but we know enough to make some pretty educated guesses. The Snake Men are wide open. With what we do know, I would heavily suggest that we do the dual attrition mechanic, vampire or vampiric and chaotic corruption. That would make invading the hinterlands an absolute nightmare, which is very lore appropriate for the region. People instinctively avoid going there. Um, for the rest of their unique traits, you maybe perhaps like a slavery mechanic or a tweaked version of that to sort of pad out the fact that they always require blood, right? So, I have to go out, get victims. Those victims eventually are drained dry. You have to keep invading and going out further. It makes a lot of sense for them. I would have them have a slavery mechanic, but have them be extremely, extremely dependent on that kind of slavery mechanic. From their roster side of things, here's where things kind of go off the rails. We only really know of, the Blood Naga, which presumably would be a lord choice. And of course, it wouldn't be hard to justify throwing in a few snakemen with, spears and swords and better snakemen who are bodyguards or what have you. But there's still going to be a lot of holes in their roster. And unlike with Norska, who pulled a lot out of the Monstrous Arcanum, or the Vampire Coast, who, typically followed the Vampire Count's roster with some tweaks, there's really nothing to take from with Khuresh, and I think that might be a step too far. So my suggestion would be, we know that the plants in Khuresh are carnivorous and intelligent. I would have a few plant units in their roster to help pad things out. Might seem a bit odd and a bit stupid, but for the region, it actually is very appropriate. The other thing I would look into, and the thing that I just know hearing the word of is going to kill a lot of you, is throwing in the fishmen. If you're unfamiliar, the fishmen were teased and then constantly shot down by Games Workshop like dozens of times, like implying that they're there and then confirming that they're not. You'll actually find even in CA's game that Marienburg makes a reference to them about how some sailors saw the fishmen, but it turned out to be a drunken rambling or something like that. The fishmen have always been teased and always unconfirmed, but you know what? This could be their time to shine. Toss them into the Snake Men. It would make a little bit of sense because they also seem to be a vaguely corrupted faction who are also, you know, basically like a version of the Beastmen too. And with all of the coastal regions of Khuresh, it wouldn't be a hard stretch to, make a little lore excuse as to why they're in there. And that could be done to fill out some more slots, right? The fishmen could be an aquatic force. Maybe they have some sort of technology that we don't know of, because the fishmen have even less lore than the snake men do. And I think between those sort of three elements, you should be 90% of the way to a roster. If you need to create, a tier 5 monster, or you need to fake some sort of artillery, that can all be done. It's not particularly difficult, but there's going to have to be some artistic liberties taken for sure. So then, with all that said, do I think that they'll actually appear in Game 3? Almost assuredly not. I mean, for what it's worth, Games Workshop actually did toy with putting out models. They produced models but didn't sell them way back, I believe it was in second edition, for Blood Bowl. Although they also never ended up getting a playable team in Blood Bowl either, although they remained very common in the lore there. Like, there was tons of references to them there. Um, But again, when you look at game three, it's got to deal with some pretty major factions way before it gets to Khuresh, right? It's got to deal with Ogre Kingdoms, Chaos Dwarves, Demons of Chaos, potentially the four Monogods, Kislev, Cathay, and then even small factions like the Nobbler Hordes and the Forest Goblins and like a dozen other things before Khuresh, I think, is even an option on the table. Now, I said in the last video that Khuresh is a major region, and it is. Unfortunately, the more I've been thinking about it, I think CA is going to take the sort of fake lore route and just stuff Vampire Counts, Vampire Coast, and Beastmen over in that region, simply because it's easier to do than actually coming up with a full faction. Although there is potentially hope in two different ways. One is that by the time Game 3 is mostly wrapped up, as I said in an earlier video, I really hope CA completely opens up the mod tools and lets modders really do new stuff, like new voice acting, new unit models, really open it up for the modding community, and then potentially the Snakemen of Khuresh show up just from the modders themselves. The other option, and potentially less likely, but still an option, is if Game 3 sells like gangbusters and they can really justify having a super long content trail, then sure, after we've got all of our major factions out of the way, there's really nothing standing in the way of properly putting in the Snakemen of Khuresh. Um, if that's going to happen, we have to have a much better content trail than we've had with the first two games. Each of them has only had two additional races and then they've stopped. If we're going by game three, that's going to be a death knell for the Snakemen right then and there. But maybe game three will have a longer content trail as it is the last game in the series. They don't have to fret about getting the next one out after it. But anyways, that's going to wrap it up for today. For next week, I don't have anything set in stone yet. I've got a few ideas, but if there's something in particular you want discussed, let me know in the comments down below and we'll do our best. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.